archives in 1762, the account of payments of excise by tavern keepers and innholders to the tavern, to the tax collector. For Love Chase, it was she had sold 246 gallons and received, the government received £8, 4 shillings, 0 pence, which is misspelled, so sorry. But 840 is my abbreviation for that from now on. She also sold 10 barrels of cider and received, had to pay for that as well. So she paid the government £8, 16 shillings and 6 pence. And again, you can also see the next year that I found was 1765. In 1766, she was also paying for the liquor that was being sold. This, by the way, I'm going to leave with Rebecca, so she'll have all these records too. So what else was happening in a tavern? As Rebecca pointed out, there were meetings in taverns. And actually, as, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, the man who just spoke. Ron was very, that interesting, beautiful ceiling in Kenniston Tavern, probably they were holding meetings up there. So there'd be all sorts of meetings held in the tavern. There could be a tavern, a meeting of proprietors of the Bow town. By the way, that means that these people have invested in the town of Bow, and they're planning to make a killing by selling land in the town of Bow. For any of you who know about Bow and Concord, there's a bit of overlap in the land that was granted, one by New Hampshire, one by Massachusetts. It was a mess. So the Bow proprietors met for years and years. A lot of times they were meeting in Love Chase's tavern. There were lots of other meetings that were held as well.
Can I ask a question there relative to the spelling?
Sure.
That interests me. Like Tuesday, T-U-E-F.
Yes. It's actually not an F. It's actually not an F. It looks like an F to us, and we see it as an F. And my students try to read it as an F, which does not work. It's actually an S. So if you look, you'll also see...
There's also a regular S.
Yeah, no. So here's a notified is definitely an F. And they used one, it only has a little notch on that side. Not on, it doesn't go all the way through like an F.
Yes.
Where else can we see it? Love Chase. Here too. That S is an odd looking one.
Bushel, it's two different S's. Bushel.
Yeah, Stratham is another one. New Hampshire at the top, you can see an odd S there. So there are some oddities that went with it. Sometimes you'll see, usually in the middle of a sentence, that they'll use that odd F, S, and if they're handwriting it, it goes down below the line just a little bit, with a little notch at the bottom with a little bitty gidget in it. And they only use it in the center.
It's a business, yeah. It's
why?
It's a lowercase.
Even at the beginning of a said, you're writing the word said, you'd use a regular S. I don't know. Okay, that's what it looks like. You'll also see they have real odd capitalizations, at least according to us, and they're using a more Germanic capitalization where they often just capitalize nouns for the heck of it. Not for any reason that I can see. For instance, on the fourth to the bottom line, see time and place. We wouldn't capitalize that. My students have such a great time. I bring in handwritten, and most of you know that students don't read handwritten and don't write with a cursive anymore. So I bring it in and I have to give it to groups of students to try to figure out what's going on there. But the spelling is different. Oh, come back. Come back. There you go. It's okay, I just went to sleep for a second. The spelling is different, and also it has those odd FS's, and so you can see that there are some oddities that go along with 18th century moving into the 19th century spelling. I find it fascinating too. My students find it frustrating. So how can we know more? Another place that I've looked is not just the New Hampshire State Archives, which, by the way, I do need to remind all of us, it belongs to us. You may walk in there and ask for any of these papers at any point in time. They are there to serve you, and there are some utterly fascinating things in there. They have a vault, literally a vault, of 18th and 17th century records. So I was allowed back there. They don't allow that anymore. When I was doing my research, and I would walk into the vault and go, I love musty old papers. Those 18th century papers are just, it's a fabulous place, so I urge you to go. But you can also see in the New Hampshire Gazette, there's a lot of information about taverns as well. So here in 1758, you'll see that they were having a tax sale on lands in Bow, but the original rights will be sold at public venue, which is a public auction, to the highest bidder at the house of Mrs. Love Chase. So they would hold auctions also at various inns, and this time they're calling her widow, innholder of Stratham. And then they give the date, etc., and it's going to be continued until they're sold. New Hampshire Gazette also, 1759, so I'm down here. The committee that was settling the lines of Bow, which didn't happen in 1759, but it kept going on, and they needed a replacement member, and they're looking for the proprietors to meet at Love Chase's Tavern in 1760, and I just listed them after that because the Bow proprietors were at her tavern. So there are a lot of actions
that the majority of the Bow proprietors were people from Stratham. Maybe some of your ancestors here were investors in this.
Good to know.
Yeah, and also our very own Samuel Lane was the clerk of this whole operation, and so it was a convenient place for him to hold the meeting.
Well, it also explains some of the connections with his tavern keepers, doesn't it? With the Bow proprietors, they're a good example, I think, of also other towns doing that. My own town of Plymouth came from a lot of people who lived in Hollis. And so you'll find that the proprietors for Plymouth, who didn't have near the issues that Bow had, also were from a single town. That's a really interesting point. Did I see a hand up? Okay. And so, why was this happening at the tavern, I ask at the bottom. The other thing to think about is another place, another source is from Samuel Lane. That man's almanac is just a wealth of information. And living in Stratham, you know that very well. He wrote, Chase's Tavern on the Portsmouth Road was an important social and political center for Stratham. There were town meetings, electioneering had happened here, selectmen's meeting, business was held here. As a matter of fact, Charles Nelson said the selectmen made it their headquarters for the transaction of town business. In other words, it's a political center as well. Now, why weren't they meeting in the townhouse? Why weren't they meeting where you would expect them to meet? It was cold. Think about it. This time of year, I mean, we're getting really close to town meeting time. The town buildings are cold, and they weren't used on a regular basis, whereas usually pretty close by there was a tavern that was warm. So sometimes they would even begin the meeting in the cold townhouse, adjourn it, and to a tavern where they would actually hold the meeting. And so clearly there's something going on here where Love Chase's Tavern was a place where they liked to meet. It also says something, though, about their trust of her. So here she is, she's hearing what's going on within town, she knows all the nitty-gritty that's happening with her neighbors. As the select board is meeting, she and the people who work for her were walking in and out of wherever they were meeting, perhaps bringing a candle, food, certainly drink, putting wood on the fire, hearing all that was happening within the government. So how did Love Chase come to own the tavern, the Chase Tavern? We know that she was the administratrix of her husband's estate. And her husband, as far as I know, died without a will. And she, as the administratrix of his estate, she was the one in charge of it. And she began running the tavern in her own name. Now, does that mean she hadn't run it before? No. She had run it before. She had probably been running it while he'd been doing a variety of other things. Seldom was an inn run as the sole source of income. When Rebecca talked about the domestic manufacture that women ran, there was a lot of different things that women could do and a lot of different things that men could do. Sometimes you'll see a tavern keeper, a male tavern keeper, listed as an inn holder. Sometimes you might see that same tavern keeper with a different title next to him. Maybe he was the ferry keeper. Maybe he ran, he was known as a husbandman. Maybe any number of different jobs. It's not, like I call myself a teacher. That's what I do. But a person back then would have been a teacher, an innkeeper, and it goes on. So there are a variety of different jobs that go into it. We also know how she came to own it from the New Hampshire provincial and state papers, which talk about the administration of Thomas's estate being granted to his widow. He was called, by the way, a yeoman. And remember, he ran the tavern. So he also had another name that was attached to him. And then we also, I did find the will, sorry about that. The will, the inventory of Thomas J.'s innholder, and look at what he owned. This is a very prosperous tavern. So this is 1757. He owned 10 acres and orchards that were worth £1,200. The tavern house itself, which was worth £1,500. The little, probably red house, R-E-A-D, but R-E-D house, was worth £700. The barn, $150. Then livestock worth $195. And then there was a bunch of wearing apparel that were listed, the utensils for running the farm, 5 beds and furniture, serving utensils, tableware. It had a total inventory of 5,234 pounds, 8 shillings, 0 pence. This was a prosperous tavern. So when she moved into it, recognize she's coming into a very going concern. This was a business that had been running well. And she probably had been one of the ones running it. Again, as I mentioned, the baby at her hip, the child holding onto her skirts, she had probably been inside doing a bunch of the domestic work that needed to be done. She was probably the most familiar face that they would see. So what was this woman doing in what was potentially the most disruptive business in town? Why did the town trust her? Or for that matter, why did they trust any other woman to do this business? So let's look at women and tavern keeping. Women in tavern keeping, we've mentioned there's a tremendous amount of government regulation. You need the town's permission, you need the central government's permission. There was tremendous competition. If you didn't run your tavern well, somebody would start a tavern close to you and you would be out of business. Or if the government discovered that you weren't running your tavern well, you'd be out of business. You had to run your tavern well, efficiently, and to the liking of your neighbors and your town and the central government. The licensing I just mentioned, necessary every single year. They had to get a renewal. And then you had to control drunken patrons. I mean, Elizabeth Wyberg's drunken patrons might have spilled out into the street, but most of them did not. Which meant that women were able to keep control. Did they hire men to help? Maybe. But maybe they were able to do it from the force of their own personality as someone got out of hand. The other thing that we often forget, although Rebecca mentioned it, is that taverns were a source of information. If you walked into a tavern, you might see a list of the latest laws that have been passed by the government. Or you might see a list of drunkards in town who could no longer be served. They did that too. Or you might see, here's the latest sermon, and the minister wants you to read it. The best place to post it is in the tavern. Or you might find that there's a newspaper. Maybe you don't read it. Well, somebody would be sitting there reading the newspaper out loud. By the way, in New Hampshire, about 75% of all men and about 50% of all women, we estimate, were able to read by the time of the Revolution. So unlike farther south you go, the lower the reading is. But that flow of information was constantly moving through this area. Now notice what we're mixing. Politics, religion, drinking, information where people could share the information.
Well, women couldn't vote. Right.
Aha, okay. He was just asking, so women couldn't vote. Actually, I think I have a slide where I want to talk about that. Here. So, women couldn't vote. So, there actually were no laws that said women couldn't vote. There were no laws that said women couldn't. As a matter of fact, the first law in the United States that said women couldn't vote was 1808. So let me talk about that very briefly. A femme sole, if you are a single woman, you are known as a femme sole, a woman alone. Yes, that's the old French spelling. It came over in 1066 with the Normans. A femme sole would be a woman before she got married, and she's really under the control of her husband, her father, she got married, she'd be under control of her husband. But if she was a widow, she'd be a femme sole again. And a femme sole could own property, could sell, could sign contracts, could do almost anything a man could do. In many towns, she could vote. Now that blew me away. So I was in the New Hampshire State Archives. I was going through some petitions. And we usually think of petitions as having gazillions of names on them. You could actually have a petition with a single person's name on it. It was a way of letting the government know what you needed from the government. But these women were signing along with the men in their town, saying, here's what we need to do, and we agree to this. So I have found women's names in odd places like that, usually on local matters. Remember, there were a lot of men who couldn't vote too, though. So what made some women able to vote and some not? She owned property. And that's what it comes down to. In New Jersey, for instance, after the Revolution, single women who owned property could vote. And that law that I talked about was a New Jersey law in 1808 that said women could not vote. It was very, very exact. It was the only state that had allowed women to vote, and then they were cut off. A femme couverte was a woman who had married. And if you think of the word couverte and covered, it's the same thing. It's as if they'd drawn a whole veil over a woman, and she ceased to exist in the eyes of the law. As a matter of fact, William Blackstone said she suffered a civil death upon marriage. Sounds positively horrible, doesn't it? There was another, we've got single woman, we've got married woman, those two make sense. There was one that was very seldom used in the New World, and that was a femme sole trader. A femme sole trader was a woman who was actually married, but was able to conduct business in her own name. Now, I have seen a couple of places in Portsmouth where there was a woman who acted as femme sole traders, not called that, but granted permission by the government to do it. But it did exist in a variety of places. On a more customary level, a woman could also be a deputy husband. Isn't that a great title? So it's actually one that ministers would use, and they would talk about the responsibilities of the deputy husbands in town. From 1690 to 1770, there are a whole series of wars between the French and the English and their Native American allies. There are also a series of wars between the settlers and the Indians that were French allies. So there are a whole series of wars going on. So during the war season, which would be during the summertime, the men might be off at war, or they might be off cutting down wood if they were lumbermen. Somebody's got to run the shop at home, keep perhaps, let's make it a the lumberman's out, but he may have a mill. So who's going to sign the contracts? Who's going to run the business there at the mill? Or if he is a tavern keeper, who's signing the contracts? Who's making sure that the goods are coming in and going out and the business is conducted? It's his wife. So we can find deputy husbands. These were women who were doing the job that we usually associate with men. And then widows. Once a woman was widowed and a femme sole again, she had the rights of a femme sole back. And I skipped one. Does that answer your question, by the way?
Yes, more completely than I ever do, but if she were a widow, would she have the right to inherit
Oh, yes.
all that she and her husband had worked?
No, she didn't have the right to inherit all. A widow received, by law, a third of her husband's estate. So let's suppose, if any of you read Martha Ballard, sorry, what's her name? Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's. If you read Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's A Midwife's Tale, you'll run into this, because when Martha Ballard's husband died, not died, but was away, her son took over the house and she was relegated to one little place in the house. That happened to women. So the woman, the husband dies, and the widow automatically inherits a third of his estate, but the other 2/3 go to the children. So imagine you've got a son who has inherited the house, except he's got to give you a third of it, and you and your daughter-in-law don't get along very well, and she gives you the shabbiest room in the front. That could happen. but they had to receive at least a third. Now, a husband could, however, write a will in which he could leave far more, could leave her the entire estate for her entire life or until she remarries, which was kind of the normal way of putting it.
Did this go back to English common law?
It goes back to English common law, it came over, exactly. If you go back to the 1641 Body of Liberties, that was for Massachusetts, but it was also for us, you'll read those same laws. You'll also read, by the way, that a parent could actually, a child could be put to death for disobeying a parent. So there's some extreme laws in that Body of Liberties, it's interesting laws nonetheless.
Well, you didn't show up to church every time. You were in big doo-doo.
That's true.
Yes.
So I did want to show you a couple of laws that go along with tavern keeping, and these are and they change the laws at will. You know, you never know what kind of law